You're listening to The Big Lift, the podcast of Web Trends Optimise, the CRO solution that enables marketers and developers to maximise the ROI on their digital properties. Web Trends Optimise is a powerful, feature-rich and easy-to-use solution, all delivered within a fixed-price contract with no additional cost for increased functionality ever. During these podcasts, we meet some of the key influencers within the marketing and conversion world to understand their roles and examine their challenges. Companies across the world are being squeezed by potential tariffs and increased employment costs. Add the slowdown in consumer confidence and there's a desire to do more with less to maintain margins. Today I'm in discussion with Lars Schleibarth, who is a solutions engineer at FullStory, and we'll be discussing how FullStory can actually help companies realise a better margin. So the first thing I'm going to ask Lars is, what is behavioural data analytics?
So behavioural data analytics, I think the name explains quite a bit of that, is looking in a lot of detail what people do when they interact with digital platforms, so that is websites or native mobile apps. And companies have been trying to do that for 30 plus years, but the way they did this was often by waiting for users to perform certain events. They were clicking on an add to cart button or whatever events they have defined. What you actually start to see when you take an approach that is friendlier to actual user behavior is that people before that are on a product page and they are scrolling down. And where does the scrolling slow down? Where do they focus? What do they see longer than other elements? And does that have an impact on whether that user is going to click on that add to cart button later on? So all of these tiny signals, they indicate behavior that is less easy to predict, but with modern browser technologies, modern observers that browsers have, you can actually collect that and you can have a system like FullStory having you assist that in how to analyze that.
How does that differ from, say, Google Analytics?
So Google Analytics is a great example of how this is happening in an event-based way. You have to define what effects you want to track, and that is almost impossible in itself. So yes, that works if you want to understand that a person clicked on the add to cart button, but it does no longer work if you want to understand how long was he on the page before he clicked on the button? Where did he focus on that page? What was the most interesting element for him? Maybe where was the user when he decided to click on that button? If you want to define that in events, you need 20, 30, 50 events that can potentially happen, and it will become very difficult to make sense of it. So if you increase the amount of parameters that you're tracking, it becomes way more difficult to predict which ones are going to happen. And I think this is where modern tracking systems who use observers, who see everything that is happening, they develop an advantage. They can take in these parameters, and modern technologies can help you make sense of it. Like AI technologies or machine learning, they can process a lot more data and they can recognize these behavioral patterns much, much better.
So most of the visitors that come to a website are anonymous prospects, aren't they? But they're not usually logged in or anything like that. So how can you find out more about them and turn them into potentially known visitors?
So that is exactly where behavioral data is helping. So traditionally, I would say you would find some attributes on that user, the campaign that they clicked on to reach your website, the type of device that they are using, the location that they are coming from. These are typical or traditional attributes that you would have on an anonymous user that you can use to personalize an experience. But now that what we were discussing before, if we start to look at what that person is doing on the website, we can see behavioral patterns that allow us to group that user more accurately. So the speed in which he's browsing, the elements within the page that he is focusing on, just because it's part of the viewport longer, it's visible for longer. This type of signal data will help us identify the type of sessions we're seeing. And then, of course, you can cluster that. So you can say, if we see this anonymous visitor with the static attributes that we had on this user, and we start to analyze the dynamic behavior, we can be more accurate. We understand more about what he's going to do or what he's not going to do. And this is where you can start to score this, where you can start to say, based on these behaviors, we see a higher likelihood for this user to convert. And based on those behaviors, we see a lower likelihood for that type of user to convert. So we can take into consideration everything that existed before, the location, the campaign that people clicked on. We see all of that. But then we also see the speed in which they're browsing. Are they using the search, or are they browsing via recommendations that we present on the website? And then when they are using recommendations, are they focusing on other elements than people that are using the search? And what we will figure out is that when using the search and the search keyword is very specific, that might have a positive impact on the chance that somebody converts. When browsing and going back to listing pages very frequently, and people seeing varied products for a short amount of time, that is potentially somebody with a low likelihood to convert. So this is then the type of scoring where behavioral data kicks in and is in real time trying to understand what's going on in the mind of the user.
So is there a kind of a scorecard that you put together to be able to say this behaviour equals that? And is that scorecard, if there is such a thing, different for each type of industry or each type of client?
Well, when we do this, we are modeling a user, and we can run models that have different objectives. So an objective could be somebody's propensity to buy. If I have a high propensity to buy, I am very likely going to convert. I have a medium propensity to buy, so I'm on the fence. I'm not yet sure whether I will convert or not. And I have a low propensity to buy. Conversion is maybe not going to happen. But you can have these models with different goals. If I am a subscription business, maybe I want to measure against churn. So is this user going to stay active with me? Is he engaging with my platform like before? Or do we see that this user is lapsing? And when he's lapsing, what is the moment, or where do we have to be concerned that this user is becoming inactive? And that could have an impact on the churn score that somebody has. So different types of models, but same methodology. We're looking at user behavior in the lowest level of detail that we can get our hands on.
And would you say that's done on the fly? In other words, while it's happening, you don't have to preempt particular journey paths to be able to say, actually, we think that's the behaviour of a potential customer versus somebody who's just browsing.
No. You do that. We do that on the fly at any moment in time. So technically, I guess there are trigger points where we want this score to be updated. But once we want an updated score, we would have that back within a second.
Sometimes visitors become very frustrated because their journey isn't particularly a pleasant one. They're not finding out what they need to find out to move forward in that customer journey. And other times you get customers who are quite pleased with how they're going through the customer journey. They're finding out what they want, or you've tested it and it's giving them a very pleasant journey. Can that kind of frustration element be noticed, and can you do anything on the fly to change the content on the website?
Yeah, the frustration part of it can definitely be noticed. The happy part is more difficult, as the user doesn't really demonstrate that in how he interacts with the page. Maybe he's celebrating behind the screen, but there's I'm
just thinking. People would go to, if your website is well laid out and you've got a good path, you'll see people read a paragraph. You could say, actually, to read that paragraph, it probably takes 4 seconds. And then they click the next button or whatever it might be. So the pleasant journey is they're doing that, they're behaving like you expect them to play, and they're hitting the button. So I'm sure that's kind of being able to gauge a good experience. But the frustrations that you can see, actually, I'm trying to know how you can pick up that frustration and alter the customer's journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and actually, the compliment, the way you almost caught the pleasure in a KPI, so the time to task, how fast is he doing it, and is he taking the part that I laid out? That is exactly how we would do pleasure. Frustration is a lot easier. So one of the indicators of frustration would, for example, be a rage click. And the rage click I also like to explain because you frequently see it in real life. Namely, when you're in an elevator and you're in the elevator with somebody else and there is a button to close the door, people will click that button and the door doesn't close immediately, and then you see them push it again and again and again. And that type of behavior is seen on websites as well. People click on something, the page is not responding, and then they start clicking on it again, and they give it a bit of time to respond, but there is no response, and they click on it again, and then they start to rage out, and they just click on it. You see people who rage click it for 50 times, so they get really angry. But that is exactly the type of behavior that is really difficult to capture if you're not focusing on behavior, but if you're focusing how a page is designed to work. I have different checkpoints and I want people to complete these checkpoints. And then you have something like this, which is completely unexpected and therefore not being measured, and it just goes unnoticed. But it's exactly these types of signals. If I have a rage click when I try to add a product to my cart, that will have a big impact on how likely I will be on purchasing on that website. I mean, if this happens with a very familiar brand, I might think this is on me, but if I've seen the website for the first time, I probably assume this website is not very good and I have no interest in doing business with that website. It's less about the brand, it is about the frustration. So it's an example of something these models could actually pick up. But for the common things you can see with user frustration, there are, of course, out-of-the-box signals that will pick this up. So there's things like rage clicks, dead clicks, a page refresh. Nobody refreshes a page because it's technically needed. Yeah. They refresh a page because the page is broken. It's not, and it's learned behavior to then try and restart it with a browser refresh. So those types of signals, they are gold if you're mining for user frustration among all the other behaviors that a user has. And I actually think one of the common KPIs when you're doing more behavioral analytics is to take the user frustration rate. So for people using a specific feature and compare it to the average user frustration rate for people using that website, so that you can say the people who are using the checkout process are more frustrated than the people who are using the cart functionality. And that might give you a good clue on where to focus your work and where to optimize the experience. And I think user frustration is one of the KPIs you need here. The error rate is one, and then the completion rate, how many people complete versus how many people go out. And then the time to task is the one that should define happiness. So the speed, you typically put a person from the design team behind the website, and you ask him to perform the task in the way he designed it, and his time to task is going to be the benchmark for all of your customers. If he did a good job, the customers are just as fast as he is.
I think one of the things I've noticed where I would say is the biggest frustration is that when you've got a propensity to buy and you've actually put something into your cart, and it's probably more for a service, where you're asked to fill out a form for whatever reason, and you think you filled out the form correctly, but one of the fields obviously hasn't got the right data in it. Or I'll give you an example. You're putting it in a telephone number and you accidentally put a space in between the first part of your telephone number and the second part, and it fills it up and says, actually, this is incorrect, but it's above the page because you've gone down the form and you don't see that bit. At that point, you see it when you click on it and you're clicking on it and it goes, you don't really know what's going on. So can FullStory help in that kind of signalling process as well, to be able to say, actually, there's no point in putting a little box on the top that says you've forgotten to put your telephone number in correctly, versus actually putting a little pop-up somewhere to say, actually, you filled this out correctly, please go back and change this. Because if you can't see where the error is, or you have to scroll up, and it's essentially worse on mobiles, it does increase that frustration level greatly.
Let me think. Your question ended by where that happens. So then,
being able to use FullStory to be able to put a pop-up lower down the form versus halfway up the page.
I have seen the world's best examples here. So this is something where session replay really helps, where seeing what a user sees when he is doing these clicks will help you understand what's going on. And oftentimes you have the UX designers or the developers in the room when you show them the problem. They suddenly realize it and they're banging their head against the wall by their own felt stupidity. It's not stupid. There's just so many screen resolutions and so many exceptions that can play a role, and everybody wants to design a perfect experience. So, but I've seen them where just at the bottom of the page on where the median font is, so what most people see without scrolling, there is something that says guest checkout, and people rage click it, and nobody understands why people rage click on that item, but it's actually the header of something that is just below the font. And people would just need to scroll down. So you have great examples of where this is happening. And what we do when we see error messages is that we are actually tracking the time, how long an error message is technically rendered, and how long it is visible to the user as part of the screen that is active for him. And then we can easily see a mismatch between the error messages that are happening out of page, and we can you can even calculate ratios. How often is this happening, and what is the impact of it? So it's definitely necessary. Luckily, this is something which is becoming less and less of an issue, because, as you said, it is nowadays often a pop-up, or the error message, even if it is on something high on the form, is presented near the button that triggers the error message as well. So there's different ways how people go about it. The problem is becoming less, but it's absolutely necessary to track that kind of things.
Yeah, because that I think is the frustration, because you're almost there and you're kind of saying, yeah, I want to do this, especially if it's a purchase you're trying to do quickly.
With things like password rules and things like that, you see so many people need to make up a password, and then they are very precise in what that password needs to look like. And unfortunately, still many people are using the same password for multiple websites, so they can't use the password they have in mind. Then they end up with a password that they keep on forgetting.
Yep.
And this is... in this scenario, it's not only the website's fault. The user definitely needs to start thinking about password managers and its own personal security. But the websites being so prescriptive in what a password needs to look like is definitely the impact of that. We see it in every POC that we run. We see the impact of these simple kind of things. What's also very interesting is... if there really is a propensity to buy, people really want to buy it, and they'll go very, very far. I have seen a session in FullStory of somebody buying socks online, and the person comes to the website, searches for socks, finds socks that cost about €8 in seconds, puts them in the cart, starts the checkout, and then runs into an error. So he was on his way to come to a website and do a 90-second checkout and bring revenue. And then the website throws an error, and the user decides to try and fix it and start changing everything and starts to try all different options. And he spends 35 minutes trying to check out the socks that he could have gotten in 90 seconds. But he's past the point where frustration is going to stop him. He just wants those socks. It's horrible to watch, but it is a great example for why you're doing this.
I think one of the things also is the tone of voice that's used on error message can be... let's put it this way. There should be a lot of room for improvement, because some of them are just pure factual.
That's actually where I was going. So the error message, I recently saw a website that has had very descriptive error messages about what was wrong. And sometimes they had an error message that said, oops, that's our mistake. Yeah. But there's no pointer to the user on how to fix it. So, and you can actually see that when you tell the user what he needs to do to fix it, most of the users will fix it. If there is something like there's an on-cart exception, or oops, we did this wrong, or it's not you, it's us, that doesn't help the user in any way. And you see that in the conversion rates. I mean, these users that have propensity, they will do anything to fix it. But then if you don't tell them what's wrong, there's nothing they can do about it. They just need to guess.
Yeah. We've talked a little about the frustrations of things like that, but the other thing that I'm really interested in is, are there specific triggers, and have you got any examples of things that show intent to purchase? Is there a kind of a manual that says these are the things that are showing that a customer has propensity to purchase, and how early in that visit can that be picked up?
Yeah, so I'd say the easiest session that is going to end up in a conversion are sessions that are super decisive. So you can see the customer already knew before he came to the website that he's going to buy it, and he knows exactly what he wants. So you see very short time on page, very specific keywords that people search for. And those sessions are the easiest ones to spot, to say this one is one that is going to convert. But there's all kinds of triggers that can happen in the way. There's all different types of how you purchase. And I think the more detailed the data is, the better you can derive from the data what is actually going on. But there's still many unknowns, even if you have the most detailed behavioral data. It probably also plays a role whether that person is doing it on the tube with flaky internet, or whether they are doing it and potentially people watching their screen and therefore not wanting to share too many sensitive information versus somebody who's at home at the couch and getting these signals in is probably even more difficult. But the type of analysis, of course you see it, and the decisive ones, the ones that know exactly what they want, they are the easiest to spot and the easiest to help.
So saying that you've now got a visitor on site, brand new visitors on site, you've seen there's a propensity to purchase. How can you prevent that customer who's already, if you like, in the buying zone from being offered discounts for those people who potentially are not a customer and you're just trying to say, oh, well, here's an extra discount? Because that's where I think protecting the margins is really going to make a difference to people, because they don't want to give away discounts unnecessarily, but they still want the customer to have a good customer journey and feel as though they've got what they wanted in a great time frame.
Yeah, it's like the marketing phrase on how to spend your dollar, and you spend the entire dollar, but only half of it makes sense. And
yes,
I guess in personalization, you have something very similar, as in if you're giving somebody a discount on something that they were going to buy anyway, then you have a successful personalization campaign, because it's attributed to the campaign and the campaign converts. But you would have made more money if you didn't give them the discount. This is the part. We were talking about the scoring in the beginning. So if we can score the propensity to buy, and we group it in the same groups that we were discussing before, people that are going to convert, people that are going to abandon, and people who are still hesitating, then you can change the narrative for each of these versions. So if somebody is going to convert, we can try and get an upsell or a cross-sell in. If I'm selling pizza online and the person comes to my website, immediately picks the salami, qualifies for high intent to convert, I can still in the checkout try to upsell drinks. I can still in the checkout try to upsell crust. And this person, I give him some new ideas, some new triggers on how he could spend more money. And I do this because he's going to convert. If that same person is hesitating in which pizza to select and is spending much more time configuring it, and maybe searches for something and has no search results, then the score could be lower on the likelihood that this person converts. And maybe in this scenario, I do want to incentivize the checkout. If we see behavior that is in line with many other sessions that are abandoning, maybe we need to complete different message. We need to offer advisory. We need to point towards the pickup possibilities that we maybe have instead of delivery, and make sure that this person goes back into the consideration phase. So we have time to optimize, or, well, it's not really optimizing here, but we want this user to reconsider, because we know if you're going in the checkout at this point, you're going to abandon. So we need to do something else. We need to get you back in the consideration phase and maybe show you different content there, so you find what you are actually going to convert on. So yes, if we take, and in this example, a score on propensity, labels for 3 different categories, and then very different messaging to each of the categories, to make sure that we prevent doing what we described before, that we prevent offering a discount to somebody who's going to buy anyway, that we lose a conversion because somebody doesn't really want what he put in his cart, and that we and this way you then try to increase your margin and your revenue.
So that brings me on to a question I've always had in my head, is that a lot of marketing departments are goaled upon conversion and not goaled upon profitability. So, as an example, using lots and lots of Google AdWords, and then they're spending £50 on a Google AdWord, and their purchase is only £75. There's very little margin left in that, even though they've converted. Do you think there's a possibility with a solution like FullStory to actually make marketing departments accountable for margin?
I think I'm not so lots of personal opinion and less real experience. Mm-hmm. But I think if you're looking at retailers that are really large in size, like an Amazon, they actually don't care about margin. They reach their margin by the sheer volume of transactions that is happening. But I think in smaller shops, people are more aware, or people that maybe also have a offline presence and their margins are under pressure because they're also paying. I think margin is more important for them. That retailers I work with that are under price pressure, they prioritize this sometimes. And luckily, even customer experience teams start to take ownership of these types of discussions. And you want to stand out not by having more products or cheaper prices than Amazon. You want to stand out by having a more unique offering or a more tailored support for your website visitors, and you want to stand out by the experience that people have. And then KPIs are shifting with that. So I'm not sure if it's not the case right now. I just think that the big brands that everybody knows, that they don't care about margin that much. They care about growth and they care about volume.
I think it's always been the case that big brands, by the case of their turnover, are going to make sufficient profit. But when your turnover is smaller, it's very difficult to be able to justify spending a lot of money to be able to get a smaller return on investment. And I think that return on investment, and I'm encouraged from what I'm hearing from you there, is that more marketing teams are looking at that net profit as opposed to just the conversion.
Yeah. There's always the attribution, but a single transaction that makes the CFO happy, and four different teams in marketing, the AdWords team who got him to the website, the email team that wrote him an email to come back, and all of them are celebrating the conversion. All of them are counting the money that is going in the bank account, and the CFO is not seeing it. Yeah, I think it's that.
So we've kind of talked a good deal about some of the things that the product can do. Have you got a good example of where FullStory has actually utilised this behavioural data analytics to be able to drive an incremental, not just revenue, but profitability?
Yeah, the pizza example I gave was very real. So scoring the users during the configuration of their pizza to change the messaging in the checkout afterwards, and then do it in these groups. That's a real example of one of global pizza companies working with pizza delivery companies working with FullStory.
Because I would think that actually a pizza company has got a lot of different moving parts, which are all kind of applicable towards the end of the checkout. So you say, well, I want to buy a pepperoni when you start off with it, but then you kind of think, well, do I need those wedges? Do I need all those other bits that go with the pizza? That must be quite an interesting scenario to be able to utilise your behavioural analytics to be able to add those things in, as we've just talked just now.
Yeah, it is.
Is FullStory a product that can be used by in-house teams, or is it a kind of a fully managed service that you offer?
No. FullStory is a software vendor, so we sell licenses to our software, and so we have very limited people who are working in services. We always try to help our customers either use the tool ourselves, use one of or have one of their existing partners use the tool for them. We even can work with partnering companies who could run it for them, so a FullStory partner that we introduce them to. But as FullStory, we want to be the technology vendor. We are not the best for doing the services, and we work in the model that our customers require from us. So that's either onboarding themselves, onboarding their partner, or working with an existing FullStory partner to use it. But definitely the goal of making or democratizing analytics, it should not be a vendor exercise. It should be something they can do themselves.
So Lars, we've got all this information, all this behavioural analytical data out of FullStory, and we're now sitting there and saying, okay, we've got all this stuff. How do we make sure that that actually works and that we trust that data that's actually coming out of FullStory? Because obviously from an optimization perspective, such as WebTrends Optimize, we can take some of that data and start showing different things. But how do you get the feeling that companies take what you've got and build it into their optimization story for a better customer experience?
Yeah, exactly. So this is something where we work hand in hand. So with FullStory, we can do a lot of the behavioral analytics. We can create these scores, but we are not manipulating any of the content. And we would work with companies like WebTrends Optimize and say, take this score as input and now run an experiment. So we have the score for every session. For each label, the score over 90 is what we call the people that are going to convert. We are going to give 75% our experience and 25% is going into a control group. And then we would start to figure out if is the label correct? Are these people really converting with is it significant? So the verification of what we are doing then sits at the level where you manipulate the content and where you actually execute the experiment. But this is exactly how we work together with WebTrends Optimize or others, and where we need to define a plan and say, if we do it this way, does that build trust in the model? And does it allow us to test whether the model is still working, or do we get some kind of a fatigue? So how often do we need to tune it? That type of analysis is then happening in conjunction with the execution engine.
Yeah, because there's always a lot of discussion with regard to what should we be testing, what should be run with an optimization program. And I think FullStory from the sounds of it gives you a great understanding of, you can pick out little bits of that, or you can look at it all as a full customer journey. But there's so much data that's coming out of FullStory that the optimization plan from say WebTrends Optimize is actually quite easy to put together. And I would say it's quite interesting to be able to use that behavioural data as opposed to using just the normal bog standard Google Analytics to actually deep dive a little bit more. Because I know our optimization consultants really enjoy getting to grips with something which is exciting and new and different and very granular at times as well. So it seems like it's a bit of a marriage made in heaven.
To these optimization tools, they get something extra with FullStory, and they can carefully test this before they start trusting it. They still have the existing, oftentimes more static attributes to run experiments in a way that they have done this for years. But we offer, on the side of that, we offer a new type of data that is derived from more detailed signals. And we strongly believe it's working. And we challenge everyone to test that out and prove it's working. I mean, the results we see are very performant for us. They give us this trust that with this new type of behavioral data, we're onto something. But of course, you need to test it out and you need to see it.
Absolutely. Lars, thank you very much for your time. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure we'll have a few examples together to be able to pull for our next discussion, which will take place hopefully in a few months' time. But for now, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, John. It was a pleasure to be here, and hopefully this was interesting for anyone listening.
It sure was.